In this video, we are going to start exploring statistics through the collection and use of data. Surveys are one way of collecting data, and they're mainly used to collect primary sources of data. That just means data that comes from the original place that it exists in. There are many different types of surveys that you can use, and some of them include paper surveys, online surveys, and observations. Now, there are many more different types, but these are probably the main different forms of surveying that we'll talk about. Surveys are made up of questions that help us collect data and do it in a bit of a planned and systematic way so that we know what we're going to collect when we begin. Now, there are a few different things that we can do to help us make sure that our questions are really rock solid so that the data that we collect is reliable. Survey questions should use really clear and simple language so that it doesn't confuse maybe the people taking the survey or maybe the people that are collecting data, because if the questions aren't clear, then the answers or the responses that are collected can be just as unclear and very messy. Survey questions shouldn't be written in a way so they try and trick people, or maybe written in a way to get a particular response. They should be fairly balanced questions that don't influence the person's answer. And finally, survey questions should be designed so that they collect a specific type of answer. So for example, if you're wanting to know a person's favourite food, you need to be clear that you're after foods and not animals or days of the week. If you're trying to collect heights of different people, you need to be clear about what unit of measurement you'd like that height in, so that you don't get a different mix of answers, some in centimetres, some in millimetres, some in inches. When we survey people, we can survey many different groups. The two different types of groups that we're going to talk about are populations and samples. We're going to talk about a few different examples. I'll write populations in black text and I'll write samples in blue text. So an example of a population might be every single Australian on census night. And census night is just a particular night run every 4 years where every single Australian household is surveyed. So that would be a population because every single Australian is surveyed and asked these questions, whereas a sample might be a smaller group, a more manageable group that we can ask or maybe use data on. So rather than trying to use the data from every single Australian, we might get a random sample of 20 different Australians. So if we're using a random sample, that just means that we've randomly picked 20 Australians and the chance of picking anyone is even. So it's just a randomly selected group. Another example of a population are students at our school. So we're talking about every single student at our school. Whereas a sample, which is a smaller group, could be students in 8A. So it's a smaller group, it's a particular group of students rather than the whole group of students. Another example of a population are the rabbits in Australia. So that's every single rabbit in the entire country. Whereas a sample could be maybe the rabbits that are observed on a particular day or within a particular time frame. So why would you choose to use either a population or a sample? Well, if you were to use a population in a survey, well, you're guaranteed to get representative data that covers every single person or every single thing in that group, which is great. However, sometimes that can be really difficult to track down every single person. So maybe you're wanting to get information on all Australians. Well, that's really hard to track everyone down. Or maybe it's really expensive. Maybe you can't afford to go and survey every single Australian to ask your question. So you might choose to find a sample or a smaller group that kind of represents the bigger group. It's pretty similar. So for example, if we choose a random group of Australians, we're going to get a mix of all sorts of different people, male and female, different ages, different jobs, different nationalities, and we can use the findings from these 20 people to kind of give us an idea of what happens with every single Australian. Likewise with rabbits. If we wanted to do a survey of rabbits and find out if they had a particular disease, well, it's really hard to find and get access to every single rabbit in Australia, but we might be able to observe and survey rabbits that we can see on Monday in a particular location. Now, it might not be as large of a group as the entire population, but it'll give us a fair idea of what the rest of Australia might look like. Similarly, in our school, if we want to find out how students are going during remote learning, we might not have the time to survey every single student, or maybe we don't want to bother every single student with a survey. So we might choose a smaller group, maybe it's a group of students from a particular class that we might survey instead. So the data that we collect can be grouped into two different groups. The first group is what we call categorical data. The second group is what we call numerical data. So basically, numerical data is anything to do with numbers. Categorical data is pretty much everything else, but let's explore these two further. So numerical data can also be split into two groups. So we can have discrete data and we can have continuous. So some examples of continuous data and some examples of discrete data. So discrete data can only take a certain number of values, and by that I mean they can only maybe be particular numbers. So if you're talking about how many people are in your family, well, that's only whole numbers. You can't have fractions, you can't have decimals, and you can't have percentages. So that would be an example of discrete data. Whereas continuous data can be any number within a given range. So rather than being limited to maybe whole numbers, like people in your family, continuous data could be anything between two values. So for example, you could be talking about somebody's height. So you might describe a person's height as 123 centimetres, but you could also write 123.5 centimetres, or you might be even more specific and write someone's height as 123.49 centimetres. So height is an example of continuous data because it could be any number between a given range. Now we know that height has to be higher than 0, and you generally don't get anyone taller than 3 meters. So, our range would be from 0 centimeters to 300 centimeters, but it could be anything in between that. So with our categorical data, this can also be split into two groups. We have nominal data and ordinal data. Now remember, these types of data, the categorical type, they're not numbers. So this is the type of data where we don't use numbers to describe or measure them, or we shouldn't really say measure. So an example of ordinal data are things that you can sort into an obvious ranking. So for example, it could be t-shirt size. So we might have extra small, small, medium, large, extra large. They have a really obvious ranking to them. We can sort them because we know that one comes before the other. Whereas nominal data doesn't have an obvious ranking. So that could be colours. Now you might say, well, yes, you can sort those alphabetically, but it's not really about whether you can sort something alphabetically or by how many words are in the name, or how many letters are in the word. This is about the characteristics. So there's no obvious ranking to colours. There's no obvious ranking to things like different types of food. Whereas t-shirt size, days of the week, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, and other words where it's really obvious that they go in a particular order, they would be ordinal data. So to recap, data can be split into two main groups. We can have numerical data, just think numbers, and we can have categorical data, so just think words. Now for our numerical data, that can be split up into two groups as well. We have discrete numerical data, which are just data types where there are particular numbers that we can use. So they might just be whole numbers, for example. So people in your family can only ever really be whole numbers. Or the number of shoes that you have generally can only be whole numbers as well, and hopefully even numbers. Whereas continuous data are maybe things that we measure, and they can take any value within a range. So if we're talking about height, it can be decimals that go for a very long time. If we're measuring how much flour goes into a recipe in grams, then, we're talking about, maybe 125 grams, but you might be even more accurate than that and go further along with your measurements in decimals. Then we have categorical data. So these are the words. So first of all, we've got nominal data that has no obvious rank to it, things like colours. Then we have ordinal data. So these are categorical data that have an obvious rank to them or a way that they should be written. So the example that we spoke about was t-shirt size, but we can also think about things like days of the week, months in a year, year levels, so year 7, year 8, year 9. They would be categorical data as well, not numerical, because we can't really perform any operations on them like add them together. So you can't get a year 7 and a year 8 and then all of a sudden get a year 15. You can't add those types of things, so that would make it categorical.